Hello and welcome to the first episode of Patch or Scratch. I'm Shred. My two co-hosts will be Orbit and Aspect from Team My Intent, and together we'll be analyzing the latest balance changes in the world of Dota. Now, unfortunately, Aspect will not be able to attend this episode, but will be in future episodes. Let's get right to it. First of all, we have Ancient Apparition. Chilling Touch mana cost rescaled from 140 to 110, 120, 130, and 140. The way we feel about this is that it's a decent hero made better. Much more viable to take one level in Chilling Touch for extra harass early on, and it makes him a better tri-lane support.
I absolutely agree with that. I think you might see it out a lot even coming up close to level 1 or level 2, because now it's still going to be plus 50 magic damage for 3 attacks on 3 heroes in a tri-lane. The only downside is that it's 110 mana on a hero with 325 base.
It's a good buff though, for sure.
Yep, definitely agree. I think we're definitely going to see more Chilling Touch earlier on.
Moving on to Batrider. Batrider can no longer attack while using Flaming Lasso. Now, this is pretty interesting. We feel that it's a needed nerf. Batrider will struggle a bit more with killing in 1v1 lanes, such as mid, but it leaves him untouched as an initiator for the mid to late game.
Definitely. I mean, now, of course, his ult is now going to be more about pulling than attacking. And this is going to matter a lot for those early game kills. When Batrider hits level 6, for example, and starts to use his ult to engage in a 1v1 situation, as you mentioned, it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually kill someone outright because of the damage output of your ult now effectively being pretty much zero. You're only relying on your Firefly or potentially Flame Break as well. However, in the late game, it's still going to be really good because you still use it as that pull in the late game.
Yeah, good buff, good nerf though, I would definitely say.
Yeah.
Moving on to Bounty Hunter. Now, this we had a few disagreements on. The change is that Track no longer reduces armor. The general consensus is that it doesn't really change much, and that he still needs additional nerfs. Track is still really good, and it's the gold that does it, not rather than the armor reduction.
Absolutely. I mean, you're still going to be picking Bounty Hunter for that core amount of gold that you get. That is the reason he's so popular right now in this current patch, because adding that gold on top of the gold buffs that you get from the recent patch changes previously just makes it such a good hero to put in that long lane. Sure, it's -1 armor, -3, -5, I think, is going to be neglected, I guess, now in this patch. But at the same time, I feel like it's not enough. We need to have some fixes to the gold.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Now, Centaur. He's not enabled in Captain's mode yet, so we haven't really seen him play that much, or if any, but he was definitely too good in public games. Now, the nerfs are, his movement speed has been decreased from 305 to 300, Double Edge no longer interrupts channeling, Stampede now applies a 100% slow instead of a stun. As always, units cannot be slowed below 100 movement speed. The way we see this is that it's a massive nerf to Stampede. People can now TP away from Centaur after he's used his stun, which means Centaur is escapable when he's ganking. The nerf to Stampede also makes it so that he can cast, or so that other people can cast spells and attack, even though they're slowed.
Yep. I think that's the biggest thing. What you mentioned before. As soon as he uses his stun there, his hoof stomp, you can TP out. You're not really inhibited by the fact that he could have another potential stun up. And the fact that you can still attack and cast is going to be incredibly important when dealing with a Centaur. I love this change. I think it's necessary, and I think it's the exact amount of nerf that the Centaur needs to just bring him back from outside of that almost demigod tier into the normal pool.
I agree, definitely. I think now he's just good rather than, holy shit, we need to pick this guy up.
Yep. He does still have that clear creeping, creep clearing potential as previously. You can still down a creep wave with a hoof stomp as well as a double edge combo.
Which means he's still a very good pusher.
At the same time, now he's not out of reach of the top.
Yeah. Moving on to Clockwork. Now, this buff is kind of interesting. We see the reason behind it, but it's not gonna do that much. Basically, agility growth increased from 1.2 to 2.3. Now, this is a buff to his armor late game. It makes him a bit more tanky, makes him scale a bit better, but it doesn't end up being that much. It's around 3 more armor at 25, um, and we just don't think it's going to play in that much.
Yep. I mean, the agi growth is pretty good. He's going to attack a little bit faster, and as you said before, around 3 more armor at level 25. But people are going to be picking Clockwork for the reasons they picked it before, and not because of this agi buff.
Mhm.
He might see a little bit of increase in popularity, but he's not. It's not going to be based on the agi buff. It's going to be based on how the hero plays and the role within the team.
Yeah. We move on to Dazzle. Dazzle's buff is pretty interesting, we feel. Shallow Grave cast range rescaled from 400, 600, 800, 1000 to 550, 700, 850, 1000. Now, this is a good buff. It makes him a bit more viable in tri-lanes and makes his skill set more versatile. It feels like he needs a bit more though.
Mhm. At the same time, I totally agree that he needs more to be kind of into the upper tier of supports, but most people only really keep one level of Shallow Grave in the early game anyways, and having that extra 150 range might be the difference between getting it off in time and having your carry just like rage at you for missing it.
Yeah. Also, it might let him focus more on his other skills early on, which is going to be very big for him, and it doesn't make him as mana dependent or level dependent. Sorry.
Yep.
And that's kind of the move we think Ice Frog is making.
Mhm.
Moving on to Doomringer now. Ice Frog likes to joke around a bit with Doomringer, and he's actually nerfed this in the exact same way he buffs it now. But the changes are Scorched Earth now also affects other units you control, and Doom now has too much armor, which means he starts with 1 armor rather than 0. Now, these buffs are interesting, particularly the first one. Armor buff doesn't do that much, but what we think is the reasoning behind it is that it makes him more viable in the jungle. He can now jungle fairly efficiently without taking too much damage, and kind of moving towards that, we think his role is going to shift a bit. This first change with the Scorched Earth now affecting other units he controls might make Necrobook a core item, giving him more pushing power, which is something he always lacked.
Exactly. He's more of a push hero in that sense now, which is really nice. And as we mentioned before, the jungle potential now of Doom is just a little bit better because of that 1 armor. In lane, he's still going to take a decent amount of damage though from right clicks without something like a stout shield or even just a ring of protection to increase his armor by a little bit.
Yeah. And then we get to Drow Ranger. Now, Drow Ranger isn't kind of has the same thing going as Centaur. Centaur and Drow Ranger aren't enabled in Captain's mode, but we can still kind of make a judgment on them. The change is that True Shot aura now only affects non-hero units within 900 range of Drow Ranger. This is a much needed nerf. Having a global aura for range creeps to start hitting like mega creeps is just absolutely broken. Note that the aura is still global for heroes, and what this basically does is that it makes it so you can't toggle the aura on creeps in team fights and end up with 3 push lanes, but still lets her split push fairly well.
Yep. On top of that, it's also kind of the anti-visage build with his summons. I've seen a couple of videos of summons just completely wrecking other teams, doing something like 150 to 200 damage per attack.
And they
It's
attack
just
fast.
insane.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he comes at around 1500 damage with
Yep.
those familiars.
It's a 900 AoE, correct?
Yeah.
So this is still going to make it so that Eidolons, for example, are really good in team fights and everything,
Yeah.
but not as much in the split push situation as we mentioned.
Yeah. Moving on to Earthshaker. Earthshaker, these buffs we really, really like. The changes are that Aftershock stun duration rescale from 0.3, 0.7, 1.2, and 1.5 to 0.6, 0.9, 1.2, 1.5. Basically only changes the first 2 levels of it. Aftershock damage increased from 25, 45, 75, 115 to 50, 75, 100, and 125. Enchant Totem cooldown decreased from 6 to 5. Basically, this is a buff to Enchant Totem, all of it. It makes it worth it to take 1 level in Enchant Totem early on, while before we saw players skip it in favor of another Aftershock level first. This is a very good buff and will probably come into play soon.
Yep. The fact that the Aftershock level 1 now completely guarantees a totem hit because of the 0.6 second stun instead of the 0.3 second. In some situations before, you may have seen something like Earthshaker try to get the enchant totem, but he's just a little bit too slow to catch up to get the hit before the other person for example, casts their wind run if they're wind runner. That's going to at least guarantee the hit to occur.
Yeah. Um, Moving on to Enchantress, untouchable attack speed reduction increased from 20, 40, 60, 80 to 20, 50, 80, 110. Now, first level is unchanged here. Um, Makes her a lot tankier against carries, still squishy against burst damage though. Might be picked up more against heroes like Night Stalker and other tower divers, but doesn't change that much in the end.
I think it's a really interesting change. We might see people maxing it a little bit earlier because minus 110 attack speed at level 4 is pretty insane.
Mm.
But the thing is, her other spells are just so good. Nature's
Yeah.
Attendant is pretty much necessary to max first because of the amount of heal that you'll get with it. And Enchant, while you can keep one level in it and then go for maxing Untouchable now, um, it's going to have a lot better of a slow. So the kill potential that you get from leveling up Enchant is going to be very necessary with Enchantress. So it'll be better in the mid game and late game when you do normally get it, but I don't think people are going to be leveling it maybe 1 or 2 levels early, but nothing more than that.
I agree. I don't think we're gonna see people max Untouchable much faster because her other spells are just too good.
Mhm.
Moving on to Jakiro now, we actually had a few disagreements, both or all three of us rather, regarding this. Ice Path damage from 100 to 25, 50, 75, 100. Now, what we all agree on is that it is a very needed nerf. 100 damage for a 90 mana at level 1 was just too good. It was too efficient. He's still a good tri-lane support after this nerf, and Ice Path still fulfills its role of controlling a tri-lane, and he's still a very versatile hero.
Mhm. At the same time, though, Jakiro pre this patch was one of the best level 2 heroes in the game. You'd be doing 100 damage with the Ice Path, and then around 100 damage as well as a 4-second slow at 30% with the Dual Breath. So it's a really good change, just because now you can't really rely on your Ice Path as a nuke. It's still kind of potentially a harassment tool with a stun and maybe getting one auto attack off, but it's not going to be pushing people out of lane as much as it
No,
was in this previous patch.
exactly.
Still a really strong spell though,
Yeah,
but it's manageable now.
probably not going to change his role in the metagame too much. He's still going to be picked and banned regularly.
Mhm.
Moving on to Lycanthrope. This we felt was fairly interesting. Base int increased from 15 to 17, and Spirit Wolf's armor increased by 1. Now, the armor buff means that his wolves are obviously tankier, meaning his jungling gets a bit stronger. His laning is still fairly good, or, well, it's unchanged. It's the same as it was before. The int buff is what's interesting here, though. What we think is the reasoning behind this is that it might allow him to cast one more set of wolves at the start of the game. Now, it could also be that they just want to kind of reverse some of that mana cost on the wolves thing, make him cope better with that.
Yep. Before this patch, Lycan was one of the strongest heroes in the game, almost constantly banned or picked first. And then after the patch, the huge nerfs to his jungle potential, that was a couple of months ago actually. He's never picked right now. He's very niche in that sense, and almost always if he's picked as a laning safe carry to push. These changes are almost pretty much just to revert him back to being able to jungle a little bit better, just because it's so challenging to jungle him now in the past couple of patches without using your hero to tank and take damage like that. It's very interesting, and I think it'll bring Lycan a little bit back into the hero pool if it works as Ice Frog intended it to.
Yeah. Moving on to Magnus. Now, this hero currently is probably the most popular first ban or first pick in the game. Skewer no longer affects magic immune units. Skewer cast range rescaled from 1200 to 600, 800, 1000, and 1200. Reverse polarity duration decreased from 2.5, 3.25, 4 to 2.25, 3, 3.75. Skewer nerf is pretty good here, I feel. But the range nerf is very large. He's going to be very hard to long lane solo now. Nerfing both skewer and reverse polarity is pretty gutsy, but it's needed.
I don't necessarily agree in the sense that the skewer range is too large. I think it's perfect in the sense that it's going to be very difficult for him to long lane, as you mentioned.
Hmm.
His mid lane's still going to be relatively potent, though. It's going to be a pretty good mid lane hero. I really like the fact that Skewer doesn't affect BKB units now.
Yeah.
Heroes like Enigma, if they get a BKB, don't have to worry too much about that, about a crazy Magnus coming in from the side and just ramming into you. Um, Reverse polarity change isn't that big. It's a micro change, which is
Yeah.
relatively nice because I don't think it's that big of a threat at the moment. I think Skewer is what made Magnus really strong, and the fact that it now needs to be maxed to get to that 1200 range, I think that's a pretty good change.
Definitely agree. Um, Moving on to Medusa. Now, this hero isn't in Dota 2 yet, which is what we mainly play, but it is in Dota 1, and it's been balanced for Dota 1. Stone Gaze cooldown decreased from 140, 110, 80 to 140, 100, and 60. 1 minute cooldown at level 3 is going to be pretty big.
Yep. I mean, the Stone Gaze is just it's a pretty strong spell on its own, and just the amount of late game potential that Medusa has, being able to cast that on a 1 minute cooldown, it's really not unlike Naga Siren's ultimate. Sure, you have the sleep and the engage with Naga Siren's ult, but the amount of control that you get out of the Stone Gaze is going to be really important, especially considering a lot of people are going to be trying to focus on the Medusa in these late game team fights. So I feel like the 20-second decrease on her ultimate there at level 3 is going to be very nice for her.
I definitely agree. Moving on to Mirana. Mirana's buff here is pretty interesting. Moonlight Shadow, which is her ultimate, duration increased from 11 to 15 seconds. Now, this is a pretty big buff, but we feel it forces her even more into the 4 role we've seen lately on her. She needs a stat gain buff to go back to being a carry, and all these buffs to her spells are just going to force her more into a support role.
Yep. There's still the same fundamental issues with playing this hero like a semi carry, in the sense that because of her poor stat gain, you need basically at least 2 damage items to really shine. Whereas in comparison to other main carries who only need 1 damage item, it's a lot of extra farm on her. I do really like the extra 4 seconds of Invis. It's pretty awesome, but it won't change how she's being played. And I feel like, as you mentioned, she's going to be more and more reverted into that semi support role.
Yeah. Moving on to Morphling. Morphling was absolutely ravaged by last patch. The nerfs to him just basically shoved him into the lowest win rate in the game. He just doesn't deal well with it. And
Second lowest.
second lowest now
Shout
with
out to my
Timbersaw.
Timbersaw, yeah.
Now the nerf is, or the buff rather, cast animation time decreased from zero point 0.4 to 0.25 seconds. Now this is a very needed buff. It cuts his combo time back a bit. Not being able to cast in waveform made his combo take 1 to 2 seconds longer. This reverses that a bit. It's a step in the right direction.
Yep, absolutely. He's still the fact that he's still unable to cast in waveform is still one of the biggest issues with this hero. But it's going to be seeing a little bit more play. It's most likely going to help. It's definitely not going to hurt. At least he's going to increase a bit in win rate, most likely from this. But at the same time, you might not see him played in the competitive scene for a little bit, at least until something else gets buffed.
Exactly. Moving on to Necrolite. Necrolite, this is very, very interesting to us. This is probably my favorite change in this patch, actually. Reaper's Scythe stun slash delay increased from 1 to 1.5 seconds. Now, this is kind of a double-edged blade. It's a longer stun, but it's less burst damage. Give supports an enemy team more time to pop a mechanism or something like that. Defensive spells. Spell is a lot more versatile now, though. Makes him better 1v1.
Yep. As soon as I saw this, I was thinking to myself, man, why are they nerfing Necrolite? But at the
Yeah.
same time, I really like what you said about having a longer stun. In fact, I might even go as far as to say that they might even make it a 2 second stun a bit later down the road, because it still helps a lot with shutting down heroes, and it's still I mean, it still has the same fundamental uh, purpose that is Necrolite Ultimate. Um, it's very interesting. It could do very well for the hero, or it could do very poorly, depending on how the teams react during that 1.5 seconds. So it'll be really interesting to see down the road how teams or how players make use of this.
Yep. Now, we move on to Omni Knight. This was something we kinda couldn't really agree on. Purification cast range rescaled from 400, 500, 600, 700 to just a flat 700. Now, the way I feel this change is going to play out is that it makes him a better support, much like Dazzle's buff. Spell will still be maxed first, though.
Yep. As for me, I actually think in terms of competitive play, you normally see Omni Knight, if you see him at least, being played in that long lane. And I feel like the added range to the level one purification lets him last hit a little bit more using the heal in those situations, just to hit a creep or something to get that pure damage onto the creeps to get some last hits off. At the same time, while it's a really, really good spell, and of course you're still going to be maxing it, um, it's interesting. I don't know if it's going to be doing enough in that long lane situation because I mean that's really the only purpose I can see coming out of it with the 700 range onto creeps to last hit in at least that way.
Yeah, it's pretty much just a general buff. I don't think it's gonna change the way he's played too much. Moving on to Phoenix. This is a hero that isn't in Dota 2 at all, and I've actually never actually seen him played. So I'm gonna have Orbit do everything on this one.
Okay, well, so there are a decent amount of nerfs on Sunray. We have Sunray's max range decreased from 1600 to 1300. The base damage decreased from 16, 24, 32, 40 to 15, 20, 25, 30, and it now ends if you're stunned or silenced. This is absolutely massive. Phoenix was one of the best heroes in the game because of Sunray. The fact that it stops when silenced or stunned is really important and very necessary because that spell was so goddamn good. Like, if you had a competent Phoenix player playing in any lane, you could just start the harass and the zoning straight from level 1 with a Sunray. So this is going to be really important to try to see him enter the CM mode as well as competitive play.
Yeah, we're moving on to Puck here. Illusory Orb cooldown decreased from 13 to 12. Now, this is a pretty insignificant change. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't really do anything for him. Or her, should I say. Syncs up a bit better with Blink Dagger's cooldown now.
I think that's really important. I think that's very interesting. The fact that it syncs up a lot better with Blink Dagger. As well as the hero generally seeing a lot more play up against heroes like Quap and Bat in the mid lane. It's, as you said before, it's just like a very minor change. It's not going to impact the hero all that well, but it could have some nice interactions with the Blink Dagger, as you mentioned.
Moving on to Pugna. This is another pretty insignificant change, we feel. Decrypify cooldown decreased from 13, 11, 9, 7 to 12, 10, 8, and 6. This is, again, it's a good buff, but doesn't really change that much because Decrepify isn't the reason you pick this hero up. We feel it might need a strength or a strength gain buff to become truly viable.
Yep, absolutely agree. Not much to add there.
No, that's kind of just what it is. Moving on to Shadow Demon. This is another very insignificant buff. It's Shadow Poison cooldown decreased from 3 seconds to 2.75 seconds. Which means he gets more burst damage, and it's easier to stack up Shadow Poison. But the spell is so mana inefficient on level 1. This kind of just makes that even worse.
It's a 9% cooldown decrease on the poison, which, like, sure, from 3 to 2.75 sounds like, oh my god, this is going to be really good. Yeah, 9%. It's not that much. And still, you're going to be picking Shadow Demon because of his other spells, because of the amplification that comes out of his second spell, as well as just the disruption and the amount of almost presence that the disruption can have. You can save allies getting focused, as well as just start the offense with it.
Now, it'll be interesting to see if we see more players max Shadow Poison rather than take just one level in it, because, again, it's so mana inefficient, we might actually see players invest in it to get some of that damage up from it. But it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, at least.
Yep. If anything, I think there's going to be one level in Disruption, and then, of course, they're still going to be maxing their damage amplification, but then getting the levels in Shadow Poison after.
Yes, exactly. Moving on to Slark. Now, Slark is a hero never ever seen in competitive play because he is quite simply useless in higher level games. Base agility increased by 6. Now, notice there's no base damage nerf to go with this, which means his level 1 is a lot stronger. It also buffs his armor, which means he won't get poked as much. I feel this helps his mid quite a bit.
Yep, really strong in terms of early and mid. I'm pretty surprised at this, actually, the fact that they didn't lower the base damage to compensate for the agi gain. The thing is, he's still relatively squishy in the early and mid game. You're still going to be getting the same types of items on him in terms of survivability, but he's just going to be that much stronger in the early game. He might have a little bit more presence.
Also kind of increases his attack speed, letting him steal more stats early on, but not by much. Moving on to Spectre. Now, this is probably the biggest buff this patch. Haunt no longer ends when you use reality. The targeted illusion is still replaced by you though. This is absolutely huge. Spectre might actually become a viable carry now.
I find this really interesting because, as you had mentioned a couple of days ago, I believe, in maybe a couple hours ago, that Han basically the way Spectre was played in Heroes of Newerth, they made a similar change to this, and it made it one of the strongest carries in the game, pretty much, as you mentioned. That's really interesting. When I first take a look at this, I really like the change, and I think it's really necessary. But I was thinking that maybe it would add more to the confusion within team fights rather than the actual damage output. But taking a look at it now, the fact that you still have all those illusions doing damage for the full effect, it could skyrocket Spectre into a really important part of this competitive game.
Yeah, and I think we're actually going to see him picked up a lot more now. Just the fact that his dispersion still does true damage is massive. And with all those illusions taking damage at the same time, there's going to be a lot of dispersion damage coming out. I think this is probably the biggest buff.
It'd be really interesting to see what team decides to pick him up first. If it's going to be a team that has switched from Heroes of Newerth, or if it's going to be a Dota team.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's not really much more to say about it. It's just a very good buff. Moving on to Sven here. Great cleave damage decreased from 25, 40, 55%, 70%, sorry, I forgot the last step, to 20, 35, 50, 65%, and Warcry duration decreased from 8 to 7 seconds. Now, this makes him a bit more kiteable, but in the end, this isn't going to do that much. Not on
Yes,
its own.
but in the same sense, I don't think Sven needs that much to be done to him.
No.
I think they're very slight nerfs, and I do agree with this because people in the competitive scene are finding ways to deal with the Sven. They're picking up Shadow Demon a lot more. They're picking up things that can kite, even though he has that BKB. And so I really do like these smaller nerfs to him. However, paired with Magnus, I think he's still going to be a really strong force. So I can still see that combo doing an absolutely huge amount of damage.
I agree. Something to point out as well is that Icefrog might not want to nerf Sven too much, considering Shadow Demon is actually getting a slight buff. There's also a nerf to Daedalus. It's kind of a nerf slash buff thing that we're gonna talk about in a bit. Moving on to Templar Assassin. Refraction mana cost increased from 75 to 100. Now, this is actually a fairly big nerf. One bottle charge is no longer enough for one refraction cast. Indirectly makes Obsidian Destroyer a much better mid hero against Templar Assassin.
Yep. Just because of the fact that you can Astral Imprison constantly, and she might not even have enough mana overall to be able to cast Refraction. I really like this nerf. I think it's absolutely necessary, and I really enjoy seeing it. The fact that early Refraction now still costs 100 mana means that using it in the early game is going to have to be managed a whole lot more. In the previous versions, you'd see TAs just almost, I wouldn't say spamming Refraction, but using it quite often in order to get those last hits up to get her bottle. And then as soon as she gets her bottle, as you mentioned, you just use it once, pop the Refraction again, continue with the lane presence there. So it's going to be a lot more difficult for TAs to control their lanes. And very necessary, and I think it's going to be a really good fix to TA.
Yes. Many people might be saying, well, this isn't enough. But again, we're getting to a pretty big change to Daedalus, which is going to affect Templar Assassin and Sven both. We'll get to that a lot later. Moving on to Terrorblade. Now, this is another hero that isn't in Dota 2 yet, and it's a pretty insignificant buff. Movement speed increased by 5. Now, this is pretty much just to counteract the previous patch nerf to boots. Every boot in the game took a movement speed hit, and Terrorblade kind of took a little bit because of it.
Yep. It's going to be relatively minor, though, overall. The 5 move speed increase means he's a bit faster than, I guess, the average hero in the game. I would put the average at around 300 move speed. But 5 move speed, then again, in the early game isn't going to be enough to catch up with someone.
Terrorblade always gets nudged in different directions as he becomes too strong or too weak. Maybe this is the final step for him.
We'll see.
We'll see. Treant Protector. Now, okay, bear with me here. Damage increased by 10. Lead Seed cooldown decreased from 18, 16, 14, 12 seconds to 16, 14, 12, 10 seconds. Overgrowth cooldown decreased from 80 to 70. Living armor damage instances increased from 6 to 7. Living armor can be cast through the minimap. That's pretty much it's a comfortable change. Now, he does a crap ton of auto attack damage now.
Man, he got buffed like everything.
Yeah.
Just everything. Ice Frog really wants there to be Tree in this game, I guess.
And I kind of agree with that. I do love me some Tree. He might be a more viable offlane solo now, both in 1v1 and 1v3 situations. All these buffs to his spells basically means that he's more level dependent and less gold dependent.
Yep. So we're probably going to see him a little bit, at least experimented in that long lane. The thing is, his ultimate still does 0 damage, and spells can still be cast during it. So it's still a little bit iffy as to if you want to replace a general Tidehunter offlane with a Tree offlane.
Yeah.
A Roof Drellin, I should say.
And he still doesn't really have the mana to support a lower cooldown on Leech Seed. So
yeah.
Kind of a double-edged blade again, but definitely step in the right direction.
I want to see some Quelling Blades on Tree so that he does like 110 damage. It'd be hilarious.
Oh, that's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
Moving on to Undying. Decay damage reduced from 40, 80, 120, 160 to 20, 60, 100, and 140. Now this is so good. We love this.
I'm so happy.
Level 4 Decay now does 220 damage instead of 240. We might see different skill builds on him now. Rather than maxing Decay every game, you will most likely see a lot more max Tombstone builds.
Well, I'd say the Undying skill build was very interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that people just max Decay as much because they still went for that Tombstone.
Oh, yeah.
But they were able to skimp out on Decay levels. They would get 1 level of Decay. Because of that 40 damage being so strong, they could then just pretty much start
yeah.
maxing Tombstone ASAP. But now, because Decay is nerfed in the early game, only doing 20 damage, it's going to be pretty important. I feel like people are still going to get Decay, but they might get 2 levels in it, which might kind of delay the Tombstone as well as his ultimate a little bit, at least.
Yeah.
He won't have the level 1 presence. That's important.
Very needed change. Couple that with the recent bug fix in Dota 2, where Decay healed him for a bit too much, he might actually become a more balanced pick right now.
Yep, hopefully.
Hopefully.
I have such a challenge playing against that hero.
Oh yeah, I just can't do it either. Moving on to Vengeful Spirit. Wave of Terror damage increased from 18.75, 37.5, 56.25, 75 to 30, 50, 70, 90. Now, not only is this a lot easier to say, but it kind of buffs her strength as a support. I personally feel she might become almost top tier support now. Buffing the first wave level means she might be used more in roaming strats again. Interesting buff, as previous buffs made her carry potential better.
Yep. It's a slight buff to the wave damage. It's going to be really interesting to see how people are going to skill Vengeful Spirit as a support now. We might see a lot more just keeping 1 level in her stun and then maxing both the Wave of Terror as well as the Aura just to get the damage as well as push going, which was a build that was seen in the Chinese scene a couple of years ago.
Also seen in Heroes of New Earth when she was picked over there.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to Viper. Base strength increased by 3. Now this doesn't really do much. He still has fundamental issues that needs to be addressed if he's gonna get picked up. But it makes him tankier and harder to trade auto attacks with early on. We might see him picked up a tiny bit more now, but being able to TP away from him is still an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice. It translates to about 57 health. So that's like maybe 1 more auto attack in the early game. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much it, though.
Yeah, we don't think it's gonna change that much. You might see him as a niche pick, kind of as before. Mm-hmm. Moving on to Warlock. Now, I actually got schooled on this because I underestimated this buff. Shadow Word cooldown decreased from 20 to 16. Now, I wrote that he needs more, and he still doesn't fit into the metagame really. And you pointed out that Spectre and Warlock was a really good combo back in around 2009, and
yep.
Spectre just got buffed.
Yep, this is a really good buff to that combo as well. With the new Shadow Word, it's going to be on for 9 seconds and then off for 7 seconds. So over half of the time, ideally, you're going to have Shadow Word on someone. It's going to be really good for the harassment potential as well. Warlock in general is a really good support hero in terms of his attack animation and his damage. He has good damage, great animation, 600 range, as well as that heal that you can get onto your carry if he's taking damage. So we might see a lot more Warlock Spectre coming up.
Yeah. Moving on to Weaver. Shikuchi damage increased from 90, 100, 110, 120 to 90, 110, 130, 150. Now, it makes him a bit less level dependent. It's a good buff, but honestly, we don't think he's going to be picked up a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a decent buff, and I like it, but Weaver still has some of those issues that he needs to deal with in the sense that um, you need to have a lot of farm on him for his potential as a carry to really shine. But it is a really decent buff, and I like the fact that maybe his level 7 is going to be at least a little bit stronger.
Yeah. Moving on to Winter Wyvern. Now, this is a hero that's been introduced very recently in Dota 1, and neither me or Orbit actually play Dota 1 anymore. But we'll go over the changes anyway. Arctic Burn cooldown decreased from 60, 50, 40, 30 to 50, 40, 30, 20 seconds. Splinter Blast cooldown decreased from 8 to 7. Fixed Arctic Burn versus Roshan. Now, since we don't actually play Dota 1, we don't
can't
really
really
know
comment
how
on this.
we don't really know how this is gonna play. We don't actually know what he does either, really.
Yeah, this hero was introduced a couple months ago to Dota 1. Unfortunately, I had already switched full-time to Dota 2 then, so not really much to comment on this, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we'll move on to Zeus, which is the last hero change here. Strength growth increased from 1.8 to 2.3. Now, Zeus kind of fades off late game anyway, but this will allow him to get more spells off in a teamfight late game. All around a good buff, but might need some slight number tweaking to his spells.
Yep. In the early laning phase, it's not going to be put that much into effect. And the problem with that hero is that Magic Stick, the introduction of the Magic Stick and the Magic Wand just really made Zeus kind of a poor choice of a hero because of the fact that you just get so many charges when he starts to use his Arc Lightning to last hit. So it could be a little bit of an issue there. But it's not a bad strength gain now, which is a step in the right direction. It just, maybe we need a couple more steps.
Yeah. Now, we get to the item portion of this patch, and these were interesting to us. First of all, we have Daedalus, even though it says Barisa du Kianon. This is the Dota 1 name. The Dota 2 name is Daedalus, and the change to this is the crit multiplier decreased from 2.7 to 2.4, and the recipe cost decreased from 1200 to 1000. Now, this is kind of a nerf slash buff. Like, we've had a few of those this patch where it's kind of, I've used this word a lot today, but it's a double-edged blade. For some heroes, this comes out as a pretty big nerf, and for some heroes, this is a pretty big buff. Now, it's an indirect nerf to Templar Assassin and Sven, but it's a buff to most other heroes. Less expensive means it might be worth picking up a lot more. Multiplier nerf might be a decimal point too big, is what I feel.
I absolutely agree with that in the sense that the nerf is quite a bit. But, I mean, you see Daedalus so much more than you see the Monkey King bar, which is kind of its damage output counterpart. So maybe Ice Frog is looking to kind of increase the popularity of MKB in that sense. The recipe cost decreasing from 1200 to 1000. I don't think it's that much of a double-edged blade in that sense because it's only 200 gold less. It's more the fact that it does so much less now. That 0.3 multiplier is pretty substantial.
Yeah. Moving on to Crystallis here, which is the cheaper part of Daedalus. Damage decreased from 35 to 30. Now, this isn't really that big, but it's another indirect nerf to Templar Assassin. It comes out at around 8 less crit damage, but it's not as big as the Daedalus nerf.
Yeah, the fact that the crit multiplier stays the same means that you really just have 5 less damage, and then the crit chance on top of that 5 damage. So if you crit, you're really only doing around 8 less damage. Not too much to worry about there, I would say.
Now, I think this is going to make it so that Templar Assassin can't really go Crystallis as the only damage item she has. She might actually have to get other items first. Moving on to the Eye of Skadi. Now, this I like a lot. HP bonus increased from 200 to 250. Mana bonus increased from 150 to 250.
That's a big mana bonus.
This is a much needed buff to Skadi, I feel.
Medusa, here we come. That's all I can say about this.
Here we come. I agree. This is kind of an indirect buff to all range carries. Tooltip still needs to be fixed to reflect that it stacks with lifesteal orbs on melee as well in Dota 2, rather than just in ranged. And
yep. I mean, how
But
many times have we seen Scotty in the competitive scene in the past couple of months? Like pretty much zero. So really, Ice Frogs here is looking to make it a little bit more popular in that sense.
this is also kind of an indirect buff to Morphling. He kind of gets quite a bit better by this, actually.
Yep.
And I'd
It
say,
allows him to really decrease his strength and increase the agi there.
yeah. Moving on to Shiva's Guard. Freezing Aura's attack speed reduction increased from 25 to 30. Now, this is a good buff, but the aura isn't really the reason you picked up this item.
I mean, in some cases it can be. I think it's a minor buff, but it's not a bad buff. The thing is, heroes that normally do get Shivas are still going to get it, and heroes that normally don't get Shivas probably aren't going to pick it up because of this buff.
I agree. Now, moving to this very last change, Harpy's Chain Lightning mana cost reduced from 90 to 50. Now, my notes are actually, this is actually the change with the biggest notes for me. This makes Chen and Enchantress a lot stronger. Notice Enchantress' direct buff as well. This might be a push to make her come back into the game. I'd like to point out that this is still terrible on Doomringer. He doesn't have the mana to support this still. This comes out at about 10 spell casts, I believe, with the mana pool.
Really, I see a lot of people saying, "Oh my God, Doom is so good now because of Harpy." No, no, not really. Doom really can only cast 4 Chain Lightnings, whereas with Chen and Enchantress, if you do get that creep under control, that's 10 Chain Lightnings. It costs 50 mana. The creep has 540 max mana. This spell is on a 4-second cooldown with 900 range. So basically, if you get that in the early game, that is your one mid lane right there. You can just camp that Harpy in the mid lane. If you get 10 Chain Lightnings off on a hero, that's 1,050 damage, including magic resist. That is a lot of damage and a lot of presence in a lane. It's just insert one lane here, basically.
Yeah, this is basically the new Vulture creep. And I think it might be too good, actually.
Yeah.
That kind of wraps this episode up. This was episode 1 of Patch or Scratch, where we talk about the latest balance changes of Dota 2, or Dota 1, I guess, as well. Again, we are usually 3, but one of our co-hosts wasn't able to make it to this very episode. Either way, we hope you enjoy this, and we'll probably keep doing it.
Yep. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at OrbitDota, as well as my stream on twitch.tv/orbital. And yeah.
Yeah, also, I guess I should shout out my Twitter and our missing host Twitter as well. My Twitter is ShredL, and missing host Asway is AswayJ on Twitter. You should follow us. We do quite a bit of streaming on Twitch TV as well. My channel is ShredChan, and your channel is OrbitL.
Yep.
Right, so that wraps it up. Thank you for watching.